And we can help them if we de-emphasize the whole idea of a best friend, especially for fifth and sixth graders, younger kids. Having a best friend feels so critically important to them. But as far as I'm concerned, it's kind of a lose-lose proposition, because if something goes south in the friendship, you're adrift. You don't have anywhere to turn. Meanwhile, everyone else around you is looking in, feeling like a third wheel. And we know that the kids who are able to float between different peer groups actually end up doing much better socially in high school. They're able to practice social skills with lots of different kinds of people. So really encouraging our kids to branch out and spend time with lots of different people, including people that are really don't have much in common with them.
Hello and welcome to the Sunshine Parenting Podcast, where we talk about ideas for raising kids who become thriving adults, and we also talk about being thriving adults ourselves. I'm your host, Audrey Monkey. Here on the podcast, I share my experiences parenting 5 now adult kids and working with thousands more as a summer camp director for the past 4 decades. I'm the author of Happy Campers, and I love sharing encouragement and ideas for living more positive, connected lives. Topics I researched extensively for my master's in psychology and continue to explore today. I created this podcast as a place to share what I've learned and to encourage us all to raise and be thriving adults. Hey, Sunshine Parenting listeners. I am so excited to bring you this brand new episode with my friend Phyllis Fagell. We're talking about her brand new book, Middle School Superpowers, Raising Resilient Tweens in Turbulent Times. I know you're going to really enjoy our conversation, and I encourage you to pick up a copy of Phyllis's book. I am finding it so helpful in my work with campers at camp this summer, and I think a lot of the skills that she talks about in the book are really relevant for any age, including adults. Enjoy this episode. Phyllis Fagell, welcome to the Sunshine Parenting Podcast.
Happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So this is so much fun because we have actually gotten to know each other a lot over the last couple of years. So I not only love your book that I'm holding in front of me, Middle School Superpowers, Raising Resilient Tweens in Turbulent Times, which is awesome. I also just think you're the most phenomenal person. I'm so excited that we've connected and can talk about stuff.
Thank you. And we may hear my dog in the background. He only chimes in whenever I'm actually doing something on air. So,
of course,
but he usually comes down within a few minutes.
Oh, of course, he wants to be included. I left my yappy dog over at camp and just have this old one that I don't think will make any noise while we're talking. Anyway, if people don't know you, I just a little bit about you. A couple things. I think even before I got to know you, I remember loving your tweets on Twitter. That what I remember and what I think you still do, and what I also see in your book, are these amazing quotes that you have heard from kids who you work with, I think mostly at your school. Is that right?
Yes. And some of them are my own kids, because all kids in this age group are just so funny. And I didn't set out to include them in the book, but everyone had asked me to write a book just full of those quotes. And I thought, you know what, maybe I'll put a few of them at the beginning of each chapter, because it's so easy to forget to include that student voice or that kid voice. And it makes a huge difference when you hear how they feel in their own words.
Oh, so true. And they're funny and fantastic. And one of the things that I especially love about you and the way you present everything about your work and about kids is that it's a very hopeful and positive view of kids. And that is what I've always believed. I've always been a big defender of teenagers. I get to see at summer camp the most amazing kids and just teenagers just at their best. And when you see kids in all their, at their best, at their worst, and everything else, you really learn to value them as people and not just label like an age as, oh, it's terrible or whatever. And that's what you've done in this book. So why don't you talk a little bit about how your first book was Middle School Matters. But you decided to write this book, Middle School Superpowers. Why don't you explain why you decided to write this particular book at this time?
Sure. Well, first of all, I love the way you talk about kids too. And I agree. They're so funny and purpose driven and equity oriented. And as I write in the book, there is no human on the planet who is more convinced than a tween that they can change the world with nothing more than a well-worded petition. And suddenly they have chocolate milk Thursdays or whatever it is that they want. And I wrote this book in part to continue a conversation that I started in Middle School Matters, which was to challenge some of the negative cultural rhetoric around the phase. But truth be told, when I wrote Middle School Matters, it was intended to be a what to expect when you're expecting a middle schooler. And it was going to be the end all be all of everything middle school. I would never have to write another book. I did not intend to write another book. I was happy to let other people write more books. And then the whole world imploded. And seemingly overnight, we had a pandemic. We had kids who were isolated for long periods of time, who were not having access to friends at a time when it was so critical to their development, who couldn't practice social skills. And that wasn't all that was going on. We also had really stressed out adults, and that emotion contagion element impacts kids. We had this huge spike even before the pandemic, both in mental health issues and gun violence, which had heightened kids' anxiety and sense of feeling unsafe at school, which was showing up in all sorts of ways. And then we had this cultural divide that suddenly was settling in on us as a society, a divisive election, war in Ukraine, you name it. And as a result, when our students came back, and I know that so many parents have told me this is what they're seeing at home too, and continue to see, because the impact has had some far-reaching consequences, were kids who didn't have the same stamina, were kids who had a harder time with separation, with staying grounded in their bodies, with assuming positive intent in their peers and resolving conflict, paying attention at school, staying organized. All of the things that are difficult enough as it is for kids in this age group were 10 times harder. And so I started calling these kids extreme tweens. They're the same insecure, vulnerable, funny, impressionable, impulsive kids that we've always seen, only more so, and they required a different set of strategies. So Middle School Superpowers in many ways is an extension of Middle School Matters, but it's also going from that 30,000 foot view to a really close-up look at really specific scenarios and how we can help kids connect, recover from disappointment, deal with uncertainty, all the things that make it so hard to be human.
Well, like I said, I shared before we started recording, I'm through the first two chapters. I've been trying to get through everything, but it's been a busy week up here. But what I love, and I know what most parents will really enjoy too, is the way you wrote the book, the structure of it. So a couple of things I want to point out. I'm actually in chapter 3. I'm on super sight, but I just finished the chapter on super belonging. And I just want to say it really hit home with just some of the things we're seeing in campers this summer at camp, that, they all have this just such a strong and really good desire to belong and to fit in. And they don't yet have all the skills and information on how to do that effectively without hurting other people. And so I especially enjoyed that. But a couple things about your structure. I love how you start the chapter with sample scenarios. And like in the super belonging chapter, I highlighted a couple of them in the sample scenarios. One was making friends when you're the new kid. So, starting at a new school or a new camp. Another was learning how to identify right fit, supportive friends. And this is something that I've been talking with parents about, and we talk with our campers about a lot. Kids, I think we all have this desire to like belong to this right crowd or whatever, this perceived mecca of social life or whatever, that often is not the right place to be. So I just love that you start with these sample scenarios, then you have these great quotes from middle schools. like the one that you put in the front of this one that we were talking about. This is, you say to the kid, this might sound crazy, but research shows that kids who have a few good friends are often happier than so-called popular kids. And your sixth grader says, no offense, but I'm going to need to see that so-called research. That is so true. Cause I feel like as a parent, we spend a lot of time saying these kinds of things to our kids. Like I remember, with one of my kids telling him, people really care more about your personality. Like once you get to know someone, they look more attractive to you. And he was just convinced that it's all about appearance. It's like they don't believe you.
Right. No, and there's nothing wrong with kids for wanting to be popular. It really is part of the phase. It's an age when kids really just want to conform and fit in. And we would not be acknowledging the reality if we didn't understand that popularity is real power. It comes with some real social power. And so there's a protective element to being part of that group. What they don't realize, though, is that if they're not really authentically included in that group, it feels a whole lot worse to be teetering on the periphery of a group of kids who don't want you around or who are fair weather friends, sometimes nice, sometimes not nice, than it does to actually find a couple of people who share your values, treat you well, and make you feel good about yourself.
Absolutely. And earlier this summer, we were dealing with something that we usually don't deal with at camp, which was some socially aggressive behavior. Basically, some kids really kind of, trying to like exclude certain people and be like an in group and an out group. And what was really interesting is talking to most of the kids were in this situation where they felt really like their values were being compromised. Like they wanted to be kind and inclusive. And the power of the social group of which they felt honored to be part of was such that it caused them to not be kind and inclusive. And I really think that they all grew a lot from going through kind of the experience of talking through all this. But what they realized is that you really can't be a fence sitter. You can, like, you're either kind of standing up for your values of including people and being kind, or you're not, by not doing that. And it's really hard at that age because, like you said, that power of that desire to be part of the group, and especially if you're feeling like you're being drawn into the so-called popular group, is so strong.
Yeah, and it's real social risk for them to do anything that could potentially threaten their place in that group. And so I'm often working with kids on taking starter risks. Maybe you're not quite at the point where you can just stand up and say, that's not cool. You're being a total jerk, or whatever it is you might say if you were being really direct. But you might be somebody who could start by practicing and pulling that kid aside that they were mean to and saying, look, I saw what happened. And, I just wanted to check on you and see if you're okay, because that's where kids get their courage from taking those starter risks and seeing that they can manage it. And nobody sets out wanting to be, a mean kid. It's really not who they want to be. And half the time when kids are mean, it's because they're socially clumsy. Of course, there are situations like the one that you're talking about where kids are trying out some truly mean behavior, and the adults do have to call them out in real time and be really direct and model that for the rest of the kids. But just because another kid doesn't stand up doesn't mean that they're not a good person. It means that they actually need to work on that skill of being an upstander.
Yeah, for sure. And I can't remember where I read it, but you talk about how this age, they are at their like friendships, and that social life is becoming so important. And they also are lacking the skills and kind of the knowledge, and they're going through puberty. It's just like a lot of things happening at once. So they definitely are going to make mistakes. And this is where I think as parents and people who work with kids, we've got to view these as growth opportunities. So when they're involved in something or they have a friend situation, how can we take those and help them come out the other side with some new skills or a different way to view it or a different way to respond? I love how you worded that, the lower risk. How did you call it? A
starter risk.
A starter risk. And I love that just simply asking the person who they saw being sort of victimized, whatever, how are you doing? I saw what happened. Do you want to sit with me today or whatever?
Yes, whatever they can do. And the hope is that they get braver over time, and that dopamine hit they get from feeling good about doing the right thing is self-reinforcing. So one of the activities I do with kids in the school setting is prove to them that being a good person is less risky than they think. So I give a sample scenario in the book, and I did this in the classroom setting. We had a situation where we had some kids who had turned away someone from a lunch table, just sort of straight up exclusion. Somebody came over, they weren't that cool. They wanted to sit at the lunch table with this group of kids who are more popular. And one of the kids at the lunch table turned that kid away and said there was no room. And it was quite obvious that there was room. And so it was pure snubbing of this kid. And I then later on presented that scenario in a classroom. I didn't do it with the same group of kids who had been involved in it because you never want to shame kids. But I presented that scenario, and I first asked the group, what do you think got in the way? Why do you think no one stood up and said, actually, there's room. You can just sit over here. No one said a word. And the students came up with all kinds of reasons. They didn't want all eyes on them. They were worried they would be targeted. They didn't want to jeopardize their place in the group. And then afterwards, and I did this part anonymously because I wanted the kids to be honest, I handed out sticky notes and I asked them to write what they would think of a person who did stand up and say something in that moment, who did say, hey, actually, there's room, and just very matter-of-factly refuted what that person had said who was doing the exclusion. And to a kid, every single kid wrote on that sticky note something along the lines of, I would think they were strong enough to do the right thing. I would think they were a good person. I would think they're someone I'd want to be friends with. I'd respect them more. And what I was really trying to do was prove to these kids that they were overfreighting the social risk of doing the right thing. And that's something we have to do a lot for kids. Whether they're using a word like gay as an insult, whether they're excluding someone, we have to show them that doing the right thing is less risky than they might think in the worst case scenario.
And you feel so much better afterwards too. Like, when you debrief with kids after they've made a social error, they feel a lot of remorse and shame. Like, why did I do that? That's not me. They'll say things like, that's not me. I'm not that kind of person. So it's like when you live into the person you want to be, you just feel so much better.
Yes, it's super uncomfortable to know, especially at this age, that you have let down the adults. Kids really do care about what the adults think. And I share another story in the book about a student who had been a very kind student. And this was a kid who came to our school after being bullied somewhere else. So she was really sensitive to bullying issues. And one day, another kid came to my office and just collapsed on the floor crying because that girl, this kind girl, or typically kind girl, had said something that was really cruel. And there was no other way to interpret it other than it was straight up mean. And when the girl who had made the mean comment came to my office, I wanted to talk to her. I initially was tempted to say something like, what are you doing? What were you thinking? And I almost started in a little bit like that. And I could see her shoulders stiffen. I could see her getting defensive. I could see I was going to get nowhere. And so I shifted gears. And instead I said to her, do you think you were your best self? Put it back on her. So she was wrestling with her own values instead of fighting with me. I was dropping the rope, and she started to cry and she said no. And then she really wanted to figure out what she could do to make it right. So we have to give kids a runway back to being a good kid, to doing the right thing, and recognize they will make these mistakes.
Oh, I'm going to use that. Were you being your best self? That is the best, because that is true. Because you're speaking, I know you, this isn't you. To
Yes.
act this way. So what do we need to do to get you back to your best self? I love that. That's amazing. So let me just talk through. So also what I love, but it's always good to have little things. And I did this in my book too, just like kind of breaking things down at the end of each chapter. So I love how at the end of each chapter, you have top tips for parents, and then how to tackle the topic with your middle schoolers. So these are just it's just so helpful. I think I really envision that this would be great for parents to do as a book club or like at their school with their PTO. I wish every parent would read this, because I think a lot of what you teach, and I feel the same way, is we have these kids going through this time that's challenging, and as parents and people who work with them, we need to make sure we're helping them along on the process and not exacerbating the problems or the challenges. And I love how you just really encourage us to just sort of ask them questions. There was one part where you said, If somebody's mean to your child, don't text the parents.
So hard, isn't it? I
Yeah.
once had a parent tell me that when this was a situation where someone was mean to her son, and she said, all I want to do is call the other parents and stick daggers in their eyes. And who can't relate to that? If somebody hurts your kid, you want to go on the warpath. But I can't think of a single situation in the last several years where that's actually made anything better.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel the same way. And I think also as adults, I mean, I think, and you point to this, and we all know this, is the social lives of kids are very complex, and the nuances many adults don't see. And, there's kids who we think seem so polite and so wonderful who are perpetrating social aggression. And
Absolutely.
they're really good. They're so socially savvy that they kind of snow over the adults. So then someone else gets in trouble for, their response. And it's just, we adults often just sort of just mess up the situation worse rather than helping resolve it. And what you want us to do, and I agree with, is empowering the kids, talking them through. How could you respond differently next time? What do you think was going through their head when that was happening? Just like it's more empowering them that, yeah, that was a challenging situation. How would you like to handle it?
Yes. I mean, there were times definitely when kids need more adult intervention. If it's true bullying, and that's like the 3 Ps: power, purpose, and pattern, meaning somebody intends to wound. There's a pattern of behavior. It's not a one-off mean comment. And then there's a power imbalance. In those situations, kids typically do need adult intervention. But the rest of the time, when it's just meanness or social conflict, and you've got 2 kids who are on equal footing, this is something that with some coaching, they can handle on their own. I will also say, and I say this to parents all the time, if your kid has friends, that's great. But if your kid has friends, it means they're sometimes being mean. And we can't neglect to talk about what it means to exhibit pro-social behaviors and be kind with our kids simply because it looks like socially they're doing fine. This is a conversation that every parent has to have with every child.
And I will also add, just because again, I talk to a lot of kids and a lot of parents, and I have been just so amazed at parents who will respond to like their child's behavior with, wow, that seems really unlike them. And I know that it actually happened. How can we help them grow from this experience? Is so different from the response of, it was somebody else's fault. What was the counselor doing? And all of these things, because in every relational thing, of course, no one's 100% at fault. And, it's always this mix of give and take and different things happening and going on. And what we really want is to raise kids who take responsibility for themselves and their own values, regardless of what's going on around them or how the teacher responded or the camp counselor or whoever. But I do see that pattern a little bit with, and this is going to sound, but it's like often kids who are doing like mean or bullying type behaviors, their parents are bullying us as the, like the camp or the school. I don't know if you've seen that, but I mean, it's an interesting situation out there.
Well, our kids are watching absolutely everything we do. And so if they see you mistreating, a waiter or a teacher or a camp director or camp counselor, they're watching and they're going to mimic that same behavior, or they're at least at risk of mimicking that same behavior. So we have to be really aware that we are that mentor figure in our kids' lives and taking pains to acknowledge if we are, we're going to make mistakes too, but to then let them see us take accountability to say, you know what, I was in a really bad place. I was really stressed and I snapped at that person. And in retrospect, I was being pretty rude. We want to at least show them how to come back from that. It's not that we don't ever make mistakes. With kids, one of my favorite questions is to say, I hear you. I get it. I think you're right. Probably that it's mostly this other person's fault. And that's got to be super frustrating. If you had to own your 5%, your 4%, what would you say? And again, you're giving them that runway back. And then you've acknowledged how they feel. You validated that they're not in the wrong entirely. And they can often at that point let down their defenses enough to say, well, maybe I should have, gotten offline and talked in person, or maybe I shouldn't have, got told 3 other people that I was annoyed with her and should have just worked it out with her directly. But giving them that opportunity to have that reflection. Or just simply asking in retrospect, looking back, is there anything you would have done differently? as opposed to what were you thinking? How could you do that? Which will just shut the whole conversation down.
Yeah, I'm going to have to put all these in quotes for people because all of you, everything that you've said is just exactly how we need to learn to respond. And I'm really big on just easy questions that we can ask our kids, simple responses. Like my go-to is the empathy and a question like, wow, that sounds hard. What are you thinking about doing? As
Love it.
opposed to, it's like you said, as a parent, you're just all your shackles, whatever the word is, go up when you hear of some harm or your child's upset about something. And you just like, you're just everything in you wants to protect them and go after whoever said or did. And that response ends up kind of disempowering our kids or
And
not.
even
Yeah, go ahead.
even worse sometimes. So I'll share a story. It's not in the book, but it's a true story. There were two girls who were at each other's throats, and both parents felt that the other kid was doing the bullying and had been, communicating with the school. And this became incredibly heated to the point that the parents were fighting with one another. And one day, the two girls who had often sought help from me, either individually or together, came in and they said, "We have a big problem. We need your help." And inside, of course, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what is it now? This is just separate, don't hang out because this is not working. But they came to me and they said, no, it's a different kind of problem. The problem is we like each other now. We want to be friends, but we don't know how we're going to break this to our parents because they're never going to let us hang out. But we're kind of over it and we want to be friends. And I think as parents, we also have to remember there's a ton of social churn and kids cycle in and out of friendships. And if we go overboard, we impede the process of kind of connecting, disengaging, reconnecting. That's so normal and natural. We don't want our kids burning bridges. If anything, we want them maybe creating some distance when it's not going well, but we want to allow them to forgive and move forward.
So well said. And that I love that word. I don't think I'd ever heard that until your book, social churn. And that's such a good description of just how it is, friendships. I think I read somewhere else, and I think this is for adults too, that like friendships really like every 7 years, you kind of end up with a different group, especially depending on if you're changing careers or moving or different things happening that, yeah, you sometimes, even as an adult, you have some of your friends, like your oldies, but from like childhood, but mostly you're with the people who are kind of part of your current life structure. And with kids, it's even faster, right? Because they're going so rapidly through like, they were playing soccer for elementary school, but now they've decided to go into theater. And so now they have all these different friends. And that's, I think, normalizing that for kids, which is you talk about that as how we could help as parents, talking to our kids and saying, I had this really great friend in elementary school. We did everything together. But then by the time we got to middle school, I was more interested in this. And it wasn't like we, didn't like each other anymore. It was just that we kind of just drifted and had different interests and found other people that we had more in common with. And that's okay. You don't have to be always with the same people for all of childhood, high school, everything.
It's so true. And we can help them if we de-emphasize the whole idea of a best friend, especially for fifth and sixth graders, younger kids. Having a best friend feels so critically important to them. But as far as I'm concerned, it's kind of a lose-lose proposition because if something goes south in the friendship, you're adrift. You don't have anywhere to turn. Meanwhile, everyone else around you is looking in, feeling like a third wheel. And we know that the kids who are able to float between different peer groups actually end up doing much better socially in high school. They're able to practice social skills with lots of different kinds of people. So really encouraging our kids to branch out and spend time with lots of different people, including people that really don't have much in common with them, is good preparation for just life.
What language do you teach kids to use then when talking about their good friends that they really love?
So, as adults, one of the ways that we can talk about it ourselves to model is to say, this is my favorite person to go jogging with. This is the person who I call when I need somebody to lift my mood. This is the person who always takes my smallest problems seriously. This is the person I like to connect with once a week because I know that no matter what's going on, they love me unconditionally. They're my biggest cheerleader. The idea is to communicate that lots of different people serve different purposes. No one person is going to meet all of your needs. So the language might be something like, tell me what your favorite thing is to do with that particular friend. It might be that they're the best person to have a sleepover with. Could be something like that. Or this is your favorite person to be on a sports team with, as opposed to this idea that this one kid is going to be your everything.
Gosh, and even translating that to adulthood, again, there's a parallel of, people who put all their eggs in the romance basket, or thinking that like their spouse is going to be everything to them, and then are sorely disappointed that their spouse ends up being a human being just like everyone else, that you have favorite things to do with them and not. So I love that. That's a really great thing. And that's, kind of at camp, we talk about our cabin groups, how we want to be like a whole group, a whole team together. And there might be people that we have more in common with and less in common with, but we're still kind, and we do stuff partner with different people. And we discover sometimes friends who we didn't think would end up being our friends by branching out. So I agree with that. Just when you say, oh, this is my best friend, we do everything together, you're actually limiting yourself a lot in terms of some amazing people who could potentially fulfill some really great pieces of like your relational needs.
Yes, and it's protective, because especially as kids are growing up, they might be maturing at different rates. So one kid's playing with Legos, and another one is, ranking their crushes and into makeup and more sophisticated things. And so there could be this temporary blip where you're really not connecting, and you might reconnect later. But in those moments, it's incredibly painful. But it's even more painful if you don't have that safety net, if you don't have other friends you can turn to hang out with in those moments.
So good. Well, that I actually learned a lot there, because I haven't really ever talked about that idea of like saying, oh, this is my best friend kind of thing. Like sometimes people say, oh, I came to camp with my best friend. And I love, like, you could say instead, like, this is my favorite person to come to camp with every year, or something like that.
Exactly.
Like this is, or we only see each other at camp because we live, far away from each other, or this is my person that has been so fun to be on soccer teams with, or I like to read the same books and talk about them with this friend. That's a really great way to word it. And I think adults, we can learn a lot about that, because I think especially women tend to do that even as adults, a little bit of the kind of pairing off, or kind of being a little more like exclusive in the way they talk about their friendships.
Yeah, we don't magically become inclusive, kind people simply because we get older. It's skills that we also have to kind of sharpen and work on along the way too.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So before we close out, I just want to cover that the way you word this whole book is it's superpowers, and it's talking about all the things that, like, during this amazing growth period, which you say in the book, you kind of call it 10 to 14. Is that correct? That's what you consider kind of the
maybe pandemic, I would say 10 to 15, because there's a little bit of a lag.
Yeah, for sure. And I think people have traditionally thought of tween as being like before you become a teenager, but I agree that it's just this whole middle school, start of high school kind of phase where a lot is happening. And basically the way you're talking about is all these things happening have the potential to help our kids grow these superpowers. And I'll just read through what they are, because I think it'll resonate with parents to hear about all the amazing things that can be happening during this stage if we nurture the kind of growth and conversations and helping our kids through. So it's super flexibility. And you talk about how to manage change and uncertainty, which, especially in the last few years, we've learned is kind of the norm, not the exception. Super belonging, which again, I told you is one of my favorite. And that the subtitle is the power to find your place and make strong connections. And to me, that's pretty much the skill that we need. If you only get that and you know how to connect and find people, and that's going to help in all other areas. Super sight, power to anticipate problems and make a plan. Loved that chapter too. I'm halfway through that one, so I'm going to keep reading on that one. Super bounce, the power to learn and recover from missteps. And that's an area that parents, of course, can help with in how we debrief about them. And like your question, were you being your best self? Great opportunity in that type of thing. Super agency, the power to find your purpose and take initiative. Super force field, the power to set healthy boundaries. Super security, the power to take pride in your identity and step into someone else's shoes. Super healing, the power to cope and self-regulate emotions. Super balance, the power to set a reasonable pace and realistic goals. super daring, the power to go out on a limb and take smart risks, and super optimism, the power to find hope and humor in the hard stuff. I mean, man, I read those and I'm just like, this is not just for middle schoolers, Phyllis.
No, I told my own kids that if I, God forbid, drop dead tomorrow, I'm like, this is my manifesto. If you want to know what I think about just about everything that's involved in living sort of a meaningful, happy life, it's all in this book. Because if everything we need to know, we can learn in middle school. They say that about kindergarten, but it's really middle school when everything gets a little nutty. Kids need so much more support, and it's such a moment, an opportunity to really turn out flexible, optimistic, resilient kids with some help from the adults.
Well, I am super inspired by your book, Phyllis, and I'm going to make sure that every camp person knows about it, because middle school is the top age for overnight camps. Like, that is literally in the bell-shaped curve of camp. You get a few little kids and then a fewer older kids, but in that middle is all those like 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. I mean, that's the age that we're seeing them here. And have learned so much. Every page I read of your book, I was going back to camp and saying, oh my gosh, I just read about this. This is what we need to do. So it's a fabulous book. And I really hope that all parents will read it. I'm definitely going to recommend it to all the parents at my camp and anyone else that I can share about. Where can people find you? And I know, I love reading your Washington Post articles. Where else can people find you? Are you going to be speaking about the book? How can people connect?
Yes. I have a website, phyllisfagell.com, and I'm on social media at pfagell. I don't think they call it Twitter anymore, but I'm there. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, all those places. And otherwise, you can find this book or my first book, Middle School Matters, anywhere that there are books.
And is it an audiobook too?
It is an audiobook, yes.
And do you narrate it? Did you narrate it?
I narrate the introduction, but not the rest of the book.
Okay. Sounds good. Okay. Well, I highly recommend it. Anything else that you'd like to share? Maybe just a word of encouragement to parents, because I do agree that it's a really hard time to be parents of this age. So, what do you have to share with parents who are just dealing with the churn of their own families during these past few years, and with kids who are in this age group now?
Well, I will just share some of the research in the book that shows that kids do better when their parents are doing better. And if you have sacrificed self-care because you're prioritizing your kids' needs, you're actually not doing them a service. So if you only do one thing, I would say find somebody who is really important to you, not a best friend, but really important to you, and who cares about you, and ask them to be your go-to person. Ask them if you can talk once a week for an hour, really connect with somebody. It will help you put your own oxygen mask on so that you can be a really good listener for your own kids and enjoy the phase. I say this as a parent of 3. My youngest recently finished middle school, and I really love that the age. It is messy, it is tough at times, but they still really, really care what you think and want to please you. And it can be incredibly rewarding if you don't opt out, if you get in there and really non-judgmentally support your child through these years.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Phyllis. This has been great talking to you. I could talk to you all day. Love the book. I hope it gets into the hands of every parent. I really think probably people should be reading it when their kids are like 9, 10, 11 and up. And as adults, yeah, let's all read it. And for sure, it should be must reading for every parent of a kid going into middle school. And hopefully you'll get lots of book clubs going at these schools. So parents could get together and talk about this stuff, because if parents are approaching things with that similar philosophy, it's just going to help all the kids. A rising tide lifts all boats, right?
Yes. And there's also a parent discussion guide in the back of the book, so that if you want to have a book club, it's all mapped out for you.
Amazing. All right. Thank you so much, Phyllis. Have so much fun on your book tour and talking about this. And we'll keep talking about all your great work.
Thanks so much for having me today.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Sunshine Parenting Podcast. As always, you can find notes and links about this episode on my website at sunshine-parenting.com. If you enjoyed the episode, I'd appreciate you passing it along to a friend or giving Sunshine Parenting a rating and review on iTunes. If you enjoy listening to my voice talking to you, my book, Happy Campers, 9 Summer Camp Secrets for Raising Kids Who Become Thriving Adults, is now available on Audible. Thanks for listening and have a great rest of your day. Here's to raising a generation of thriving adults and being a generation of thriving adults.